The Texas sun shows no mercy. It beats down on the innocent and the guilty alike, baking the unforgiving earth of the plains into a cracked mosaic of despair. In that vast, lonely expanse, a story was etched not in ink, but in dust rope and silent courage. It's a tale of a good man, Dawson Chandler, a rancher pushed to the very edge of his soul. It speaks of his 2 children, their innocent faces streaked with tears, and dirt bound beside him to a fence post left as a warning. But most of all, it is the story of the woman who appeared from the shimmering heat haze, a ghost of a figure, her belly swollen with a child of her own. She offered no name, no explanation, just a strength that would unravel a dark and bloody secret that had poisoned the land for a generation. This is the story of how they were saved, and how that salvation came at a terrible price. The first thing Dawson Chandler became aware of was the pain. It wasn't the sharp, clean pain of a bullet or a blade. It was a dull, insistent agony, a chorus of torment sung by the coarse fibers of a hemp rope biting into his wrists and the brutal glare of the midday sun scorching the back of his neck. He tried to swallow, but his mouth was a cavern of dust. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through the heat-induced haze. He forced his eyes open, the light a physical blow. To his right, his son Caleb was slumped against the rough-hewn cedar fence post. At 12, Caleb was trying so hard to be a man, his face set in a grim mask of defiance, but the silent tears tracing paths through the grime on his cheeks betrayed his fear. His small hands were bound in front of him, the rope already chafing his wrists raw. To Dawson's left, little Eliza, only 8, was a heartbreaking bundle of faded gingham and quiet sobs. Her head rested against his shoulder, her own tiny wrists tied fast. They were a tableau of suffering, an offering to the vast, indifferent sky. The memory of the attack returned in fractured, violent shards. They hadn't come for the cattle, not at first. 5 men, their faces masked by dusty bandanas, led by a 6th, whose eyes were the only feature Dawson could truly recall. They were eyes of chilling amusement, the color of a winter sky, set in a face that promised cruelty as casually as a sunrise promises light. This man who called himself Blackwood hadn't shouted or raged. He had spoken in a low, almost conversational tone as his men dragged Dawson from the half-finished barn. "Mr. Chandler," Silas Blackwood had said, his voice a dry rasp. "My associates and I have a vested interest in some property your father, the late Marshal Franklin Chandler, once acquired. We believe the key to its location lies with you." Dawson had spat dust and defiance. "My father was an honest lawman. He never acquired anything that wasn't evidence." Blackwood chuckled, a sound like stones grinding together. "Oh, he was a lawman, all right. A lawman with a talent for making things disappear, especially things belonging to my father. Now we can discuss this like gentlemen, or I can provide you and your lovely children with some motivation to improve your memory." The motivation had been swift and brutal. They'd tied him to the fence first, forcing him to watch as they roughly handled Caleb and Eliza, their terrified cries tearing at his soul more than any physical blow ever could. They had tied them beside him, a deliberate act of psychological torture. "We'll be back at sundown, Chandler," Blackwood had promised, leaning in so close Dawson could smell the stale whiskey on his breath. "By then, you'll have had plenty of time to contemplate the heat, the thirst, and what happens when the coyotes get curious. You'll tell me what I want to know." Then they were gone, their laughter swallowed by the immense silence of the plains, leaving only the sun, the flies, and the slow, agonizing passage of time. Hours bled into one another. The sun climbed to its zenith, a malevolent white eye in the bleached sky. Dawson tested the ropes pulling until his skin tore, and blood trickled down his arms, but it was useless. They were tied fast. He spoke to his children in a low, hoarse voice, trying to keep their spirits up, telling them stories, making promises he wasn't sure he could keep. But as the afternoon wore on, his words became cracked whispers and their responses faded to whimpers. Dehydration was setting in, a thief stealing their strength and their hope. Despair, a thick, suffocating blanket, began to settle over him. This was how it ended. Not in a blaze of glory, but cooked alive, bound and helpless, his children suffering beside him. He was drifting, his consciousness fraying when he saw her. At first, he thought she was a mirage, a trick of the heat, shimmering off the parched earth, a lone figure walking steadily toward them from the east. She was a woman dressed in a simple dark dress that seemed to absorb the punishing sunlight. As she drew closer, he saw the impossible swell of her belly. She was heavily pregnant, a fact that seemed absurd in this landscape of death and desolation. She moved with a purpose that defied the oppressive heat. Her face was shaded by a wide-brimmed hat, her features obscured. She didn't call out, didn't wave for help. She simply walked her focus entirely on them. Dawson's heart hammered against his ribs. Was she a savior or another part of Blackwood's cruel game? She stopped a few feet away, her shadow falling over Eliza. The silence was absolute, broken only by the buzz of flies and Caleb's ragged breathing. Dawson squinted, trying to make out her face. It was a young face, etched with a sorrow that seemed too old for her years. Her eyes, dark and deep, took in the scene without any visible shock or pity. There was a stillness about her, a profound and unnerving calm. Without a word, she knelt. From a small leather satchel at her side, she produced a canteen and a clean, sharp knife. The glint of the steel was the most beautiful thing Dawson had ever seen. He expected her to cut him free, first the man, the father. She didn't. She went to Eliza, her movements economical and precise. She lifted the canteen to his daughter's cracked lips, letting the water trickle slowly into her mouth. Eliza choked, then drank greedily. The woman then took the knife and with a single expert slice severed the ropes around Eliza's small wrists. The little girl whimpered, rubbing her raw skin, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. Next she moved to Caleb. She gave him water, her expression unchanging, and then cut his bonds. Caleb, ever his father's son, tried to stand, to be brave. "Thank you, ma'am," he croaked, his voice cracking. The woman didn't respond. She didn't even seem to register his words. It was as if she existed in a world without sound. Finally, she came to Dawson. She stood before him, and for the first time he saw her face clearly. She was Hispanic, her features finely drawn, her skin sun-kissed, but it was her eyes that held him captive. They were pools of silent, shared suffering. There was no judgment in them, no fear, only a profound, weary understanding. She held the canteen to his lips, and the cool water was a miracle, a baptism that washed away the immediate terror. He drank until he gagged, the precious liquid reviving his senses. He watched her hands as she brought the knife to his ropes. They were steady, capable hands. She sliced through the hemp with the same dispassionate efficiency. The moment the ropes fell away, the blood rushed back into his hands in a wave of pins and needles. He slumped forward, his muscles screaming in protest, catching himself against the fence post. Who are you?" Dawson rasped, his voice raw. The woman simply looked at him, her dark eyes holding his for a long moment. Then she turned, collected her knife, and put the canteen back in her satchel. She gathered Eliza, who was barely conscious, into her arms. It seemed an impossible feat for a woman so far along in her pregnancy. Yet she lifted the girl as if she weighed nothing. She then looked at Caleb, and with a slight nod of her head, indicated that he should follow. She began to walk toward the ranch house 100 yards away. She carried his daughter without a word, without a backward glance. Caleb, after a moment's hesitation, stumbled after her, looking back at his father with wide, questioning eyes. Dawson pushed himself off the fence, his legs trembling, his body a symphony of pain. He watched the pregnant woman carry his child across the dusty yard. She wasn't just carrying Eliza. In that moment, she was carrying the weight of their survival, the burden of their hope. She was a silent, enigmatic angel who had walked out of the heart of hell itself, and Dawson Chandler knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that his ordeal was far from over. It had just taken a turn into something far deeper and more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. The arrival of this woman wasn't an end to his troubles. It was a new, terrifying beginning. The interior of the Chandler ranch house was a sanctuary of shade and relative cool. Thick adobe walls, a legacy from the original Spanish builders, held the worst of the day's heat at bay. It was a simple home built by Dawson's own hands, alongside his late wife, Martha. Every wooden beam, every polished plank of the floor, held a memory of her. Now a new, unsettling presence filled the familiar spaces. The pregnant widow who Dawson had taken to calling Tessa in his own mind, for the simple need to name the unnameable, had laid Eliza gently on the master bed. She moved with a quiet competence that was both reassuring and deeply unnerving. She found a basin pumped fresh water from the well just outside the kitchen door, and began to gently clean the grime and tear tracks from Eliza's face with a damp cloth. Her actions were maternal practiced, yet utterly detached. Caleb stood in the doorway of the bedroom watching her. His initial fear had been replaced by a deep-seated curiosity. He was a boy who understood the language of the plains, the meaning of a hawk's cry, the promise of a dark cloud on the horizon. But this woman was a language he had never encountered. Dawson staggered into the house, his body aching, his mind reeling. He drank deeply from the water bucket in the kitchen, splashing it over his face and neck. The relief was immense, but it couldn't wash away the questions that churned within him. He walked to the bedroom doorway, standing beside his son. "Ma'am," he said, his voice stronger now, "I owe you my life, my children's lives. I am Dawson Chandler." Tessa didn't turn. She continued to bathe Eliza's chafed wrists. The only acknowledgement she gave was a slight, almost imperceptible dip of her head. The silence stretched thick and heavy. "Can you tell me your name?" Dawson pressed, trying to keep the frustration from his voice. "Where did you come from?" She finished her task with Eliza, and then rose her pregnant belly, making the movement graceful yet cumbersome. She turned to face him, her dark eyes meeting his. She lifted a hand not in greeting, but to touch her own throat, and then shook her head gently. "A charade? I cannot speak." "You're mute," Caleb whispered from the doorway, his eyes won. The woman's gaze shifted to the boy. A flicker of something sadness perhaps passed through her expression. She gave a single slow nod. The explanation settled in the room, but it didn't feel like a solution. It felt like another lock on a door he desperately needed to open. A mute pregnant widow appearing out of nowhere to rescue them on the very day Blackwood had threatened him. The coincidence was too great to be believed. "Blackwood," Dawson said suddenly, watching her face for any reaction. "The man who did this, his name is Silas Blackwood. Do you know him?" For the first time, a visible change came over her. It was subtle, a slight tightening of her jaw, a fractional narrowing of her eyes. It was the involuntary reaction of a horse catching the scent of a wolf on the wind. It was there and gone in a second, but Dawson saw it. She knew the name. She quickly masked the reaction, her face returning to its serene, unreadable state, and gave a slow shake of her head. No. She was lying. A new kind of fear, colder and more complex than the simple terror of the fence post, began to creep into Dawson's heart. This woman wasn't a random savior. She was connected to this. He was standing in his own home, his children nearby, with a woman who was part of the very darkness that had descended upon them. The next few hours passed in a strained, silent pantomime. Tessa, as he would continue to call her, moved about the house as if she had lived there for years. She found the larder, and with a questioning glance at Dawson, began to prepare a simple meal of beans and cornbread. The familiar domestic act was so at odds with the violent reality of their situation that it felt surreal. Dawson, meanwhile, checked his rifle, a Winchester 73, and his Colt Peacemaker. He barred the doors and shuttered the windows, transforming the house into a makeshift fortress. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and blood. Sundown. The time Blackwood had promised to return. As she cooked, Dawson took a moment to study her more closely. Her dress was worn but clean, of a simple, sturdy fabric. Her hands, though capable, were not the calloused, work-worn hands of a typical frontier woman. They were softer. Her hair was tied back in a simple bun, but a few stray strands of raven-black hair framed her face, and despite her advanced pregnancy and the dire circumstances, she carried herself with a strange, quiet dignity. She was a puzzle of contradictions. He decided to try a different approach. He found an old piece of charcoal and a clean pine board Martha had used for rolling dough. He placed it on the kitchen table. "If you can't speak," he said gently, "can you write?" She looked at the board, then at the charcoal, and finally at him. Her expression was unreadable. For a long moment, he thought she would refuse. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world, she picked up the charcoal. Her hand hovered over the board, hesitating. Dawson watched, his breath held. With slow, deliberate strokes, she wrote a single word, Tessa. Dawson felt a small jolt. He had guessed her name. It suited her. He pushed the board back toward her. "Tessa, why are you here? Do you know Silas Blackwood?" Tessa stared at the name, her own name, as if it were a ghost. Her hand trembled slightly. She looked up at Dawson, her eyes pleading, then back down at the board. She wrote again, her script elegant, practiced. "He is a bad man. I heard what he did. I came to help." It was an answer, but it answered nothing. How could she have heard news didn't travel that fast in the open plains, unless you were the one making it? Before Dawson could press further, Caleb came into the kitchen. "Pa," he said, his voice low. "There's something out by the barn. Something she dropped, I think." In his hand, Caleb held a small leather-bound book. It was a diary or a journal, its cover embossed with a simple faded initial, M. Tessa saw the book, and her composure shattered. Her eyes widened in genuine panic. She reached for it, a desperate involuntary movement, her serene mask gone, replaced by raw fear. Dawson took the book from Caleb's hand. "What is this, Tessa?" She shook her head frantically, reaching for it again. He held it back, his suspicion hardening into certainty. He opened the book. The pages were filled with the same elegant script he'd seen on the pine board, but it wasn't a diary. It was a ledger. Names, dates, and figures. Lists of cattle brands from ranches all across the territory. The Chandler brand, the double T, was there next to a recent date. And then he saw the names listed under a heading of Associates. There were half a dozen of them, and one stood out circled several times, Joaquin Montoya. Montoya. The name struck Dawson like a physical blow. Joaquin Montoya was a known rustler, a gunman with a reputation for ruthless efficiency, said to ride with the Blackwood gang. He'd been shot and killed 6 months prior during a botched nighttime raid on the Miller Ranch, just south of Chandler property. The local story was that Marshall-turned-rancher Franklin Chandler Dawson's own father, who had been visiting the Millers, had been the one to pull the trigger. His father had died of a heart attack less than a month later, taking the full story with him to the grave. Dawson looked from the name in the book Montoya to the woman standing before him, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. The initial on the book's cover. M. Montoya. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in his mind with brutal clarity. This wasn't just a woman who knew of Blackwood. This was his associate's widow. The child she carried was the heir of Joaquin Montoya, a man his own father may have killed. "This was your husband's," Dawson said, his voice dangerously quiet. He held up the ledger. "Joaquin Montoya." Tessa flinched as if struck. The blood drained from her face, leaving her pale beneath her tan skin. The charade was over. All pretense of being a mute stranger collapsed. Tears welled in her eyes, real and terrible. She sank into a chair, her body trembling, and finally, after a day of profound silence, she spoke her voice, a raw, shattered whisper. He wasn't supposed to hurt children. She choked out the words torn from her throat. That was never the way of it. When I heard what Silas was planning, I couldn't. I had to stop it. Her voice, laced with a faint Spanish accent, was as real and as shocking as the ledger in his hand. She wasn't mute. She had been silent, and her silence, he now realized, was not a disability. It was a shield that had just broken, exposing them both to a truth far more deadly than a common outlaw's vengeance. The confession, whispered in the dimming light of the ranch house kitchen, hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Dawson stared at Tessa Montoya, seeing her for the first time not as an angel or a liar, but as a woman trapped in the wreckage of a life he was only beginning to comprehend. The setting sun cast long, menacing shadows through the shuttered windows, a stark reminder that Blackwood's deadline had arrived. "Your husband," Dawson said, his voice flat as he tried to process the revelation. "He rode with Blackwood." Tessa nodded, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. She looked exhausted, the strain of her deception and her long journey etched onto her features. "Joaquin was complicated," she said, her voice still rough with disuse. "He grew up with Silas Blackwood. Their fathers were partners back before everything. He saw loyalty in Silas that wasn't there. He thought it was about reclaiming what was stolen from their families. He was a fool." "Stolen by my father," Dawson pushed, gesturing with the ledger. "Is that what this is about? Old stories and rustled cattle?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "The cattle are just noise and excuse. Silas doesn't care about the livestock. He's looking for something your father took from his father 20 years ago. Something he calls the Blackwood Trust." "I've never heard of it," Dawson said honestly. "My father was a marshal. He confiscated contraband, not family trusts." "Silas believes it was a fortune in gold bullion his father had hidden," Tessa explained, her voice gaining a little strength. "He's obsessed. He thinks Marshal Chandler found it, hid it somewhere on this land, and left you the key to its location. A map, a deed, a phrase. He doesn't know. That's what he was trying to beat out of you." Dawson thought of his father, Franklin Chandler, a hard man, stern and unyielding, who spoke little of his past. He'd retired from his martial duties under a cloud of whispers, some saying he'd grown weary of the violence, others hinting he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He'd bought this ranch and worked it with a quiet intensity until his heart gave out. Could he have hidden a fortune here? It seemed impossible. Franklin had lived and died a man of simple means. "And your husband?" Dawson asked, his gaze falling to the ledger again. "What was his role in this?" "Joaquin was Silas's enforcer," she admitted, shame coloring her words. "He kept the other men in line. He planned the raids. This ledger, it was his record. Who they targeted, what they took, who got paid." Her eyes met his, filled with a desperate plea for understanding. "But he had a code, Dawson. No women, no children. When he was killed." "On the Miller raid," Dawson finished for her. "My father was there." "I know," she whispered. "Silas told everyone your father ambushed Joaquin and shot him in the back. But Joaquin's men who were there, they told a different story. They said Joaquin was trying to stop one of the younger gang members from going after Mrs. Miller. They said Marshal Chandler yelled a warning, and Joaquin turned toward the sound. It was an accident of the dark." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "Silas uses his version. It makes for a better story, a reason to justify his cruelty." She had chosen to believe the rustler's tale over the gang leaders. A flicker of respect for her ignited within Dawson. He was standing across from the widow of a man his father killed, a man who had planned to rob his neighbors, and yet the lines of enmity were becoming blurred, replaced by the stark reality of their shared threat. Blackwood wasn't just coming for an imagined treasure, he was coming for revenge wrapped in a flag of lies. The decision was made without words. They were allies bound by the ghosts of their pasts, his father, the lawman, her husband, the outlaw. "We need help," Caleb said from the doorway. He'd been listening, his young face pale and serious. "We should go to town. Get Sheriff Brody." Dawson looked at Tessa. Her expression was doubtful. "Sheriff Brody has been the law in this county for 10 years. Dawson said more to convince himself than his son. "He knew my father well." "Silas has a long reach," Tessa warned quietly. "His money buys silence and turns badges into ornaments." But they had no other choice. Leaving his children and Tessa alone was a risk, but staying and waiting for Blackwood's entire gang to descend upon them was suicide. "Barricade the doors behind me," Dawson commanded, his voice firm. "Don't open them for anyone but me. Tessa, you know these men. If they come, you know what to do." He handed her his spare pistol, a small Colt Derringer. Her hand closed around it, her knuckles white. She knew how to use it. He had no doubt. The ride to the town of Redemption was 5 miles of tense vigilance. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuing horse. The town was quiet when he arrived, the dusty main street, lit by the warm glow of lanterns from the saloon and the sheriff's office. Sheriff Lucas Brody was a portly man with a florid face and a carefully maintained air of weary authority. He was sitting behind his desk, cleaning a shotgun, when Dawson burst in. "Chandler, what in blazes has you looking like you've wrestled a bobcat?" Brody exclaimed, setting the gun down. Quickly, breathlessly, Dawson recounted the day's events, the attack being tied to the fence, the threats from Blackwood, and the timely arrival of a stranger who had freed them. He deliberately left out Tessa's identity. It wasn't his story to tell, and he didn't yet know who to trust. Brody listened, his expression growing serious. He stroked his mustache, his eyes narrowed in thought. "Silas Blackwood," he said, the name tasting like poison. "He's a phantom Dawson. His gang hits hard and fast, then vanishes. We've been trying to get a handle on him for months. No witnesses ever want to talk." "I'm talking, Sheriff," Dawson insisted. "He's coming back to my ranch. I need deputies, a posse." The sheriff sighed heavily, rising from his chair. He walked to the window, peering out into the dark street. "A posse," he mused. "That takes time. I have to round up men I can trust, men who aren't too scared of Blackwood's reputation to ride." He turned back to Dawson, his face a mask of official sympathy. "Look, son, you're rattled. It's understandable. You go on home. Lock your doors. I'll put the word out. Me and a few good men will ride out to your place first thing in the morning. At dawn. Blackwood won't attack a fortified ranch in broad daylight." First thing in the morning. It felt like a death sentence. "Sheriff, he's coming tonight at sundown. He's probably already there." "Now calm down, Dawson," Brody said in a placating tone. "Blackwood's a bully, not a fool. He knows you'd come for me. He's trying to spook you is all. He'll lay low for a few days. My presence at dawn will be a clear signal to him to move on from your land. It's the smart play, my play." Arguing was useless. Dawson could see the finality in the sheriff's eyes. He was being managed, dismissed. The feeling of dread that had been simmering in his gut began to boil. Tessa's warning about Silas's long reach echoed in his ears. As he turned to leave, his eyes fell on the sheriff's desk. Next to the freshly cleaned shotgun was a half-empty bottle of expensive whiskey and a box of cigars. The brand on the cigar box was distinctive, featuring a black wood tree. It was the same brand Silas Blackwood had been smoking. The connection hit Dawson with the force of a physical blow. The sheriff wasn't slow or incompetent. He was stalling. He walked out of the office, his heart pounding a rhythm of betrayal. He didn't turn back, didn't give any sign that he knew. He untied his horse and began the slow ride out of town, letting the darkness swallow him. But once he was clear of Redemption's last lantern, he spurred his horse not east toward his ranch, but into a cluster of rocks overlooking the road. He dismounted, tied his horse where it couldn't be seen, and settled in to wait. Less than half an hour later, 2 riders emerged from the livery stable at the edge of town. They rode hard and fast, heading east, on the road to his ranch. In the faint moonlight, Dawson could make out the stout figure of Sheriff Brody and his young, eager deputy. They weren't waiting for dawn. They were riding to meet Blackwood to deliver the news that Dawson Chandler was alone, his defenses, down his hope for rescue, completely extinguished. The betrayal was absolute. They weren't just on their own. The law itself was hunting them. Dawson untied his horse, his face a grim, determined mask. He had to get back. He had to warn Tessa. The siege wasn't coming. It was already upon them. The ride back to the Double T Ranch was a desperate race against a betrayal he could barely fathom. Every gust of wind seemed to carry the whisper of Sheriff Brody's treachery, a poison that soured the very air Dawson breathed. He pushed his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Dust Devil, harder than he ever had, before his mind a maelstrom of fear and fury. The man he had been that morning, the victim the helpless father tied to a fence, was gone, burned away by the cruel sun and the colder fire of deceit. In his place was someone harder, someone more dangerous. He was no longer just a rancher. He was the last line of defense for his family and for the strange, silent woman who had inexplicably woven her fate with theirs. He saw the flicker of a lantern near his barn as he crested the last rise. It wasn't the steady, warm glow of his own, but the nervous, moving lights of several men. They were already there. Brody's message, delivered with the speed of a Judas kiss, had arrived before him. Dawson dismounted a quarter-mile out, tethering Dust Devil in a dense thicket of mesquite, his movements swift and sure. The rest of the way he went on foot, his Winchester clutched in his hand, moving with the practiced silence of a hunter, stalking prey on his own land. He circled wide, his boots making no sound on the familiar earth. He approached the ranch house from the rear, using the deep shadows of the corrals and the water trough as cover, his heart hammering a frantic but steady rhythm against his ribs. From the darkness, he took a head count. 7 men. He saw Blackwood standing near the front porch, as if he owned it, calmly smoking one of his signature cigars, the tip glowing like a malevolent eye in the gloom. His posture was relaxed, arrogant. He was a man who believed he had already won. Sheriff Brody and his deputy were nowhere to be seen. Their dirty work was done, their hands washed clean in the darkness before the blood was even spilled. Dawson crept to the back window of the kitchen, the one with the loose shutter that Martha had always told him to fix. He peered through the crack, his breath held tight in his chest. The single lamp inside cast a pool of golden light on a scene of impossible tension. Caleb was sitting at the table, his face pale, but his back ramrod straight. He was holding a fork, his knuckles white, trying to project a bravery he couldn't possibly feel. In the bedroom doorway, Tessa stood holding the small derringer Dawson had given her. It looked like a toy in her grasp, yet she held it with deadly purpose. Her other hand was pressed low on her swollen belly, her face a mask of pain and concentration. Her breath was coming in sharp, rhythmic gasps that had nothing to do with fear. It hit Dawson with a fresh wave of horror that stole the air from his lungs. She was in labor. The stress, the fear, the long day's ordeal, it had all conspired to bring the baby into the world at the worst imaginable moment. They were trapped, surrounded, and a new life was fighting its way into a world determined to extinguish it. Chandler? Blackwood's voice cut through the night, startlingly close. He was at the front door now, his tone dripping with condescending confidence. "I know you're in there, Tessa. I know you went and got him. Brody told me everything. Now you send Chandler out and we can conclude our business. I have no quarrel with you or the child. The child of my friend Joaquin deserves better than to be born in a firefight." The lie was so blatant, so cruel, it made Dawson's blood run cold. He heard Tessa moan softly from the doorway, a sound of pure agony that she tried and failed to suppress. Caleb looked from her to the front door, his eyes wide with a terror that was quickly being eclipsed by a horrified understanding of the new crisis unfolding within the house. Dawson knew he couldn't wait. A frontal assault was suicide. He had to be smarter. He had to use the land he knew, the home he built, as a weapon. His eyes fell on the small, sod-roofed root cellar, its slanted wooden door lying flat against the ground, just a few yards from the kitchen. An idea born of desperation and fire took root in his mind. He moved silently to the cellar, lifted the heavy wooden door just enough to slip inside, and lowered it over his head, plunging himself into cool, earthy darkness. The air smelled of damp earth potatoes and the faint tang of pickling spice. From his pocket he took a match and a small, oil-soaked rag he kept for cleaning his guns. He struck the match on the rough stone wall, the sudden flare blinding him for a second. He touched the flame to the base of a pile of dried tumbleweeds he had cleared from the fence line and stored in the corner away from the vegetables. They ignited with a greedy whoosh. He then grabbed 2 large burlap sacks, plunged them deep into the barrel of pickling brine he kept for curing meats, and threw them over his head and shoulders. The cold, vinegary liquid shocked his senses, a baptism of fire and resolve. He burst out of the root cellar like a demon from the earth, the fire behind him roaring up the cellar's ventilation shaft, which exited right beside the kitchen wall. The sudden eruption of thick, acrid smoke and bright orange flame from the ground itself was a shocking, unnatural diversion. "Fire to the back!" one of the outlaws yelled, his voice laced with confusion and alarm. As 2 of Blackwood's men rounded the corner, their eyes fixed on the inexplicable blaze, Dawson was ready. He rose from the shadows like a wraith, the Winchester barking twice the sound shockingly loud in the night. The men fell without a sound, their surprise eternal. 2 down, 5 to go. He didn't hesitate. He kicked open the back kitchen door. "Tessa, Caleb, get down!" he roared. The sight that greeted him was chaos. Tessa was now on her knees, leaning against the bedpost, her face slick with sweat and her body trembling with effort. Caleb was beside her, holding her hand, his own fear forgotten in the face of a more immediate elemental crisis. Another of Blackwood's men, drawn by the commotion, charged through the front door. Dawson fired from the hip, a reflexive, instinctive shot. The bullet caught the outlaw square in the chest, and he stumbled backward, a look of profound surprise on his face, before collapsing onto the porch. 3 down. "Dawson!" Tessa cried out, her voice, a raw scream of pain and effort that tore through the noise of the attack. He ran to her side, the smoking rifle still in his hand. "The baby's coming," she gasped, her eyes locking with his, filled with terror and a plea for help he could not refuse. "Now!" Outside, Blackwood was shouting orders, his voice raw with fury as he tried to regain control of the unraveling situation. Bullets began to splinter the wooden walls of the house, chewing through the timber that held the memory of his wife, Martha. "Caleb!" Dawson yelled over the din, his mind splitting between the 2 fronts. "Get the water basin, and all the clean cloths you can find. Your sister is sleeping. Let her be." The boy, shaken but resolute, scrambled to obey. Dawson was no doctor, but he'd helped birth enough calves and foals to know the brutal basics. In the flickering lamplight, with bullets tearing through their home, Dawson Chandler, the rancher, became a midwife. He laid his rifle down, forcing his hands to be steady. He coached Tessa, his voice low and steady, a rock in the storm of her pain and the violence outside. He found a strange calm settling over him, a sense of purpose that sharpened his focus. "Breathe, Tessa. Just breathe and push when you must." He murmured his words, a strange counterpoint to the gunfire. His hands, calloused from rope and wood, were surprisingly gentle as he helped her as he worked to bring life into a world that was celebrating death. He was a man fighting a war on two fronts, one against the armed men determined to kill him, the other alongside the woman giving birth to the son of a man his father had killed. A bullet shattered the lamp, plunging the room into a terrifying darkness, lit only by the hellish orange glow of the fire outside and the slivers of moonlight piercing the bullet holes in the walls. "They're coming through the windows!" Caleb shouted, his voice cracking with fear, but not breaking. "Keep them back!" Dawson ordered, not looking up from his desperate task. He trusted his son. He had to. He heard the heavy scrape of the chest of drawers as Caleb dragged it in front of one window. A moment later, the sharp crack of the boy's small squirrel rifle echoed in the room, followed by a satisfying yelp of pain and a curse from outside. "I can't," Tessa sobbed, her strength failing, her body racked with a pain that seemed to have no end. "Yes, you can," Dawson said, his voice fierce, cutting through her despair. "You walked through the sun to save my children. You are stronger than any of them. You are stronger than him. Now, push!" With a final desperate cry that seemed to tear the world apart, the baby was born into the chaos. A new sound joined the cacophony of the siege, the thin, furious wail of a newborn child, a defiant shout of life against the encroaching darkness. Dawson quickly cleaned the baby as best he could and wrapped him in a clean flour sack Caleb provided. He placed the child in Tessa's trembling arms. She looked down at her son, her face a canvas of exhaustion, pain, and an overwhelming, transcendent love. For one sacred second, the gunfire, the fear, the ghosts of their pasts all faded away. But reality crashed back in as the front door splintered under the heavy blow of a rifle butt. Silas Blackwood stood there, framed against the fiery night, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage. His Colt was leveled directly at Dawson. "It's over, Chandler," he snarled, his chest heaving. "You've caused me enough trouble. Give me the ledger and tell me where the gold is." Dawson slowly rose, shielding Tessa and the baby with his body. He was empty-handed, his Winchester a lifetime away across the room. "There is no gold, Silas," he said, his voice weary with a truth Blackwood would never accept. "There never was. My father died with nothing but this ranch." "Liar!" Blackwood shrieked, taking a step into the room, his eyes wild with obsession. From the shadows near the hearth, a small figure moved. Eliza. Awakened by the maelstrom of noise, she wasn't crying. Her small face was set, her eyes holding a preternatural clarity that belied her age. In her hands, she held her father's heavy Colt peacemaker, clutching it with both small hands to steady it against her body. Blackwood laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "What's this, the whole family wants to die tonight?" He took another step, raising his pistol toward Dawson, dismissing the child entirely. "Pa told me to never touch the guns," Eliza said, her voice small but clear as a bell in the tense silence. "But he also told me to protect my family." Before Blackwood could process the words, before he could shift his aim, she squeezed the trigger. The gun roared, an impossible noise from such a small child, bucking in her hands and sending her stumbling backward from the sheer force of the recoil. The shot was wild, aimed low. It tore through Blackwood's thigh, shattering the bone with a sickening crack. He screamed a high, unmanly sound of shock and agony and collapsed to the floor, his pistol clattering away across the wooden planks. The fight was over. The spell was broken. The remaining two outlaws, seeing their invincible leader fall, vanished into the night, like the cowards they were. Silence descended profound and absolute, broken only by Blackwood's pathetic whimpering, the gentle crackle of the dying fire outside, and the soft, miraculous cries of Tessa's newborn son. Dawson retrieved Blackwood's pistol and walked over to where the outlaw lay clutching his shattered leg. He looked down at the man who had terrorized his family, who had built an empire on lies and obsession. "The Blackwood Trust," Dawson said quietly, the words falling like stones into a deep well. My father did find it, but it wasn't gold. He walked over to the hearth and worked a loose stone from the chimney base, a secret he hadn't known his own father had created until that very morning, when he'd searched for anything that could explain Blackwood's obsession. From the hollow space behind, he pulled out a heavy iron-bound box. He opened it for Blackwood to see. It was filled not with bullion, but with yellowed papers, old signed depositions, bank drafts, and a detailed confession written in a spidery, elegant hand. "It was your father's ledger, Silas," Dawson explained, his voice devoid of triumph, only a vast, aching weariness. "Proof that he and his partners, including Sheriff Brody, were stealing from the Army payrolls they were supposed to be protecting. My father, the marshal, convinced your father to turn state's evidence in exchange for a lighter sentence. This was the trust, the proof, but your father was killed by his own partners before he could testify. My father hid the evidence, hoping to use it one day to clean out the whole corrupt system. He kicked Joaquin Montoya's ledger, the chronicle of Blackwood's own crimes, over to the wounded man. And this is the proof of your crimes. Between the two, there isn't a jail in Texas that can hold all the men who will hang." He looked over at Tessa. She was watching him, her dark eyes filled with a dawning understanding, her hand resting on the head of her sleeping child. He then looked at his own children, Caleb standing tall beside the barricaded window, his squirrel rifle held at his side, and Eliza trembling now that the danger had passed but resolute in what she had done. They had survived. They were wounded in spirit, terrified, but they were whole. They had faced the darkness together and found a strength they never knew they possessed. The sun that had threatened to kill them was gone, and in its place a new day was waiting, a day they had earned with blood courage and the defiant cry of a newborn child. The dust settled over the Double T Ranch not as a shroud of despair, but as a blanket over a hard-won peace. Silas Blackwood and the evidence from the two ledgers were delivered to the U.S. Marshals in Austin, bypassing the corrupted county entirely and unraveling a web of deceit that reached the highest levels of territorial authority. Sheriff Brody was arrested, his betrayal exposed to the light. Dawson Chandler, his children, and the woman who was no longer a stranger began to build a new life from the ashes of the old. They named the baby boy Franklin after the lawman, whose hidden truth had been both their curse and their salvation. Tessa's silence was replaced by a quiet strength, her past not forgotten, but accepted as part of the journey that led her to them. The Chandler Ranch was no longer just a piece of land. It was a testament to the fact that family isn't always the blood you're born with, but the people you bleed for. Their story became a quiet legend in that corner of Texas, a testament to hope, resilience, and the unlikely bonds forged in the fires of adversity. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of the Wild West. If this story of survival, betrayal, and redemption moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales of real-life drama from history. Your support allows us to keep these stories alive. Let us know in the comments what part of Dawson and Tessa's story resonated with you the most. We'll see you next time.